Imagine a king who had everything a human being could dream of. His palace shimmered with gold, his army stretched across the horizon, and his name was whispered with reverence throughout the land. He had power, wealth, and the kind of authority that made entire kingdoms bow with a single gesture. To his subjects, he was the very image of triumph. Yet behind the walls of his palace, late at night when torches flickered and silence wrapped the royal chambers, the king would stare into the darkness with a heart that refused to rest. Because in the stillness of night, no amount of gold could silence the questions that gnawed at his soul. Questions so vast, so unrelenting, that even 1,000 victories could not drown them out. He could order the building of temples, command the writing of scriptures, demand the counsel of wise men, yet none of it brought peace. What haunted him was not an enemy outside the kingdom, but an emptiness inside himself. The first question came to him when he looked upon his people celebrating festivals, laughing and chasing after pleasures. What is the true meaning of life? Was existence merely a chase for wealth and pleasure, a dance of fleeting joys before the final curtain falls? Or was there something deeper, something sacred that gave purpose to all this struggle? The second question came like a shadow at funerals, when he saw noblemen and peasants alike laid into the earth. What happens after death? Do we vanish into nothingness as if we had never been? Or does something of us continue, a spirit, a spark, a consciousness that travels beyond the veil of the body? And then there was the third question, the most practical and yet the most elusive. How should one live? Even if he knew the meaning of life, even if he understood death, what good was it if he did not know how to walk wisely upon this fragile ground? Should one live for power, for pleasure, for knowledge, or for kindness? And if all things end, how should a man spend his days before the final moment comes? These three questions pressed upon him more heavily than the weight of a crown. They were not the questions of a king alone. They were the questions of humanity itself. For whether one sat upon a throne or toiled in the fields, every human heart eventually collides with these mysteries. The king sought answers from philosophers and priests. Some told him life was meant for glory. Others whispered of eternal heavens and dreadful hells. Still others claimed nothing remained after death but silence and dust. Yet the more he listened, the more restless he became. The answers felt incomplete, each one like a fragment of a shattered mirror, reflecting only part of the truth. And what he longed for was not fragments but wholeness. The palace walls, once symbols of security, now felt like a prison of unanswered doubts. His crown, once a source of pride, now seemed a burden pressing upon his brow. He could no longer be satisfied with ruling lands while his own heart remained ungoverned. For what use is a kingdom if the king himself remains lost in the wilderness of existence? One night, while walking alone through the silent gardens, the king looked up at the endless sky. The stars shone in their eternal stillness, untouched by his power, unmoved by his victories. And in their silent glow, he felt his own smallness, his own mortality. A thought struck him with terrifying clarity. I may rule an empire, but I cannot command the truth. I cannot order the mysteries of life to reveal themselves. And for the first time, the great king felt powerless. But within this powerlessness stirred a deeper strength. The courage to seek. Not to seek more lands or treasures, but to seek the essence of existence itself. He realized that the journey he was about to undertake would be the greatest of all journeys, one that no sword could win and no army could conquer. It was the quest not for territory, but for truth. And so began the king's restless search for the answers that have haunted humankind since the beginning of time. 3 questions, like 3 gates, stood before him. To step through them meant to leave behind the illusions of comfort, to confront fears that every human secretly carries, and perhaps to discover the wisdom that lies beyond. The story of this king is not just his own. It is ours. For whether we sit upon thrones of gold or wooden chairs in humble homes, we all carry within us the same 3 questions, waiting for the courage to face them. And as the king's journey unfolds, His struggle will illuminate the very path that each of us must one day walk. The king's quest began with the question that refused to leave him in peace. What is the meaning of life? He summoned the greatest minds of his kingdom, philosophers draped in robes, poets whose words could move the heart to tears, priests who chanted of heavens unseen. Each came before the throne with their answer, eager to satisfy the hunger of a king. One philosopher declared, "The meaning of life is knowledge. To study the stars, to decode the laws of nature, to master wisdom, that is the highest purpose." Another, a poet with eyes like burning coal, insisted, "Life is meant to be savored. Its meaning is in the fleeting beauty of a flower, the song of a bird, the laughter of children. Embrace each moment before it slips away." Then came a priest who spoke with solemn certainty. "The meaning of life is to serve the gods and earn a place in eternal paradise. To obey, to worship, to sacrifice. That is the destiny of all men." The king listened, nodding politely, but inside his heart grew heavier. These answers were eloquent, but they did not satisfy the fire in his soul. If knowledge were the meaning of life, why did wise men still grow old and die unsatisfied? If pleasure was the answer, why did joy dissolve like smoke in the wind? And if life's meaning was obedience alone, then why did the gods remain silent while suffering spread across the land? That night, he walked again in his gardens, restless. His crown lay abandoned on his table. Tonight he was not a king, but a man searching for truth. He watched his servants laugh together in the moonlight, unaware he was near. Their joy was real, yet he knew it would not last. He thought of the farmer who toiled under the sun, the mother who wept for her lost child, the soldier who shed blood for causes he did not understand. Could the meaning of life be something so fragile, so inconsistent? The next morning, the king disguised himself in plain clothes and went among his people. He listened to merchants, to farmers, to children playing in the dust. Each lived with a purpose, some to feed their families, others to gain wealth, others to chase after dreams. Yet behind their busy days, he could sense the same unspoken questions he carried. Beneath laughter, there was fear. Beneath ambition, there was uncertainty. Finally, weary of shallow answers, the king sought out a wandering sage who lived on the edge of the forest. This sage was known not for wealth or prestige, but for a serenity that seemed to radiate from within. Unlike others, he did not rush to answer the king's question. Instead, he asked the king to sit beside him beneath a tree. The air was still, and for a long time they said nothing. The silence itself became the beginning of an answer. At last, the sage spoke softly. "You ask the meaning of life, but look carefully, your majesty. Life itself is asking you the same question. You wish to grasp it as if it were a jewel to be held in your hand, but life is not a jewel, it is a river. It flows, it changes, it does not stay still. To demand its meaning is to demand that a river stop flowing." The king frowned, uncertain. "Then are you saying life has no meaning?" The sage smiled. "Not no meaning, but that meaning is not fixed. It is not something you find once and for all, like treasure buried in the ground. The meaning of life arises in how you live, in how you awaken. To see clearly, to love without grasping, to walk with compassion. That is where life reveals its truth." The word struck the king's heart with force. For the first time, he glimpsed that perhaps the meaning of life was not hidden in grand temples or written in sacred texts. Perhaps it was woven into the very fabric of existence itself, waiting to be seen with clear eyes. He thought of his restless nights, his endless hunger for answers. What if the meaning of life was not a distant secret, but a way of being here and now? What if life's purpose was not to conquer, but to awaken? The sage continued, "Your Majesty, when a child laughs, life is asking, can you hear joy? When an old man suffers, life is asking, can you feel compassion? When the seasons change, life is asking, can you accept impermanence? Answer these questions, and you will begin to see life's meaning." The king sat in silence, the world around him suddenly sharper, the rustle of leaves, the warmth of sunlight, the rhythm of his own breath. He realized that all his power, all his riches had blinded him to this simplicity. The meaning of life was not locked away in mystery. It was alive, pulsing in each breath, in each choice, in each moment of awareness. That night, for the first time in many years, the king slept peacefully. Yet even in his dreams, the journey was not finished. The first question had opened a door, but as dawn arrived, another question, darker and heavier, waited for him. For if life had meaning, what of death? Was all he had learned destined to be swallowed by the silence of the grave? The morning sun spilled gold across the palace walls, but the king's mind was shadowed by a question more chilling than the darkest night. What happens after death? Though he had begun to grasp the meaning of life, he could not escape the reality that all living things must one day face the inevitable. He had seen the fragile beauty of life, the bloom of a flower, the laughter of children, the fleeting victories of his reign, and now he confronted its fragility. Death loomed as the great equalizer, indifferent to crowns, wealth, or power. The king called upon his council of scholars, priests, and mystics. Each had their own answer, yet none quieted his unease. Some spoke of eternal heavens and punishments that awaited in fiery realms. Others insisted that the soul was immortal, journeying from one life to the next in endless cycles. And still others proclaimed that death was absolute, a return to nothingness, leaving behind only memory and dust. But these answers were unsatisfying. How could a kingdom built on laws, wisdom, and devotion account for the mystery of death? He had seen loyal generals fall in battle, poets die with songs unfinished, farmers pass quietly without notice. Why must life, so vibrant, end in silence? And if all that remained was nothingness, what meaning did his own quest hold? Restless, the king wandered again through his gardens, this time accompanied only by the whisper of the wind. The world seemed both familiar and strange. Birds chirped as though mocking him, flowers nodded in the breeze, and every creature moved through its days unaware of the question pressing upon him. Yet the king knew that this question was not external. It was embedded deep within his own heart. Seeking answers beyond mortal scholars, he ventured to the forest where the wandering sage had once guided him. The sage welcomed him not with words but with quiet presence. Together they sat beneath a centuries-old tree whose roots sank deep into the earth and whose branches stretched toward the heavens. In that stillness, the king felt both small and connected, a fleeting life in the vast tapestry of existence. "You wish to know what comes after death," the sage began, his voice steady and gentle. "But tell me, what do you fear?" "I fear the silence," the king admitted. "I fear that all I have done, all I have learned, will vanish as if I had never existed. I fear oblivion." The sage nodded. "Death is not the enemy, your majesty. It is the great teacher. It strips away pretense, exposing what is real. The body may perish, but the essence, the ripple of your actions, the imprint of your compassion continues. It may take forms you cannot see, in ways you cannot measure, in lives touched by the seeds you have sown." The king frowned. "Are you saying I will live again?" "Perhaps," the sage said softly, "or perhaps not, as you know yourself. What matters is not clinging to the illusion of permanence, but understanding that life and death are threads in the same fabric. Each ending is a beginning. Each loss carries the potential for transformation. Just as day gives way to night and night to day, death is part of the cycle, not the final word." The king's heart stirred. For the first time, he considered death not as a thief to be feared, but as a companion in life's journey, reminding him of the preciousness of each moment. He saw that the fear of death could blind one to the beauty of living fully, to the chance to act with kindness and wisdom while the body still breathed. Yet, even as the sage's words sank in, a quiet tension remained. Could a life so brief leave an echo that outlasted the fleeting pulse of the body? Could his deeds matter in a world where all things fade? The king realized that understanding death required him not just to think, but to live differently, to see every act, every choice, as part of an unbroken flow beyond life and beyond loss. As he left the forest, the sun dipping low over the horizon, the king carried a seed of awareness within him. Death was no longer a shadow looming at the edge of life. It was a teacher showing him how to live with courage and clarity. And yet, As twilight painted the sky with fire, another question lingered, whispering in the spaces between his thoughts. If life has meaning, and if death transforms rather than ends, then how should one live wisely so that each day matters? This question, heavier than gold and sharper than a sword, awaited him. It would guide the king into the next stage of his journey, where understanding life and death converged into the path of wisdom itself. The king returned to his palace carrying the lessons of life's meaning and the truths whispered by death. Yet a new, heavier question pressed upon his heart, one that could not be answered by philosophers, poets, or sages alone. How should one live? He looked upon his court, the bustling city beyond the palace walls, and the endless horizons of his kingdom. Men and women labored, laughed, loved, and suffered, often unaware that life's most profound question had already entered their hearts. The king realized that knowing life's meaning and understanding death were only part of the path. If he could not learn to live rightly, what use were all the answers he had gathered? At first he turned to the advice of his ministers. One said, "Rule with strength and strategy. Protect your kingdom, expand your borders, secure wealth. A life of action and achievement is the highest purpose." Another counseled, "Seek pleasure, indulge the senses, enjoy the abundance of your reign. Life is short, do not deny yourself joy." And yet another whispered, "Rule with devotion to the gods. Observe rituals, uphold sacred laws, and ensure that your life aligns with divine will." But none of these responses resonated with the restlessness in his soul. Strength without wisdom could become tyranny. Pleasure alone led to emptiness. Devotion without understanding might cultivate ritual without compassion. The king, burdened yet determined, ventured again into the quiet forest where the sage awaited. He found him seated beside a flowing river, the waters sparkling in the early light. The sage said nothing, letting the gentle rhythm of the river speak first. Life itself seemed to murmur its lessons, flowing, changing, never clinging to one form. Finally, the sage spoke. "Your Majesty, to live wisely is not to hoard wealth or chase glory. It is to walk through each day with awareness, to see clearly the suffering of others, to act with compassion, to speak truth without harm, and to let go of attachments that chain the heart. Life is a series of choices, and each choice is a step upon the path of wisdom." The king listened, absorbing the words like the parched earth drinks the rain. He thought of the farmers who tilled fields for food, the merchants who labored for profit, the soldiers who risked life and limb. Each acted according to their understanding, yet few paused to live with awareness. Could he, as a king, model a life that was not only successful but also wise and compassionate? The sage continued, "To live rightly is to embrace impermanence, to accept that joys and sorrows are fleeting, and to respond to life with clarity rather than reaction. Each breath, each gesture, each thought carries the potential for either harm or healing. Recognize the power within each moment and choose with intention." The king reflected on his past deeds, the wars he had waged, the judgments he had passed, the indulgences he had allowed himself. He saw the fleeting nature of power and pleasure, and a quiet resolve began to take root. To live wisely was not merely to exist or to rule, but to cultivate virtue, to act in alignment with the deeper truths he had glimpsed in his quest for meaning and in his understanding of death. That evening, as twilight draped the palace in hues of gold and crimson, the king walked among his people without the trappings of royalty. He listened to their stories, felt their struggles, and sensed their joys. The river of human life flowed around him, and he understood for the first time that wisdom was not a destination but a practice, a way of being fully present, fully engaged, fully compassionate. And yet, even with this understanding, the king knew the journey was not complete. Life, death, and the art of living were intertwined in a tapestry far more complex than he had imagined. As the stars emerged, whispering their silent counsel across the night sky, the king felt a quiet anticipation. The next stage of his journey awaited, a deeper insight into the impermanence of all things, the transformation inherent in life, and the wisdom that comes when one truly sees the world as it is. The path ahead was uncertain, but the king's heart, for the first time, carried a steady flame of resolve, illuminating the steps he would take toward the truths that lay beyond life's surface. The king had wandered far, through palaces of wisdom, gardens of reflection, and forests of solitude, carrying within him the weight of questions that had no easy answers. He had glimpsed the meaning of life, felt the shadow of death, and begun to understand how one might live wisely. Yet there remained a stillness he had not yet touched, a clarity that could not be read in books, debated in courts, or whispered by priests. It was the wisdom that came not from hearing, but from seeing, not from speaking, but from being. In the heart of a remote forest where the sun's rays filtered through leaves like liquid gold, he found the sage. This was no ordinary man. His eyes held the calm of mountains, his movements carried the weightlessness of flowing water, and his presence seemed to radiate a silence that was alive, vibrant, and patient. The king dismounted and approached, not as a ruler demanding answers, but as a seeker ready to listen. The sage regarded him with a quiet smile. "You have come far," he said, "and yet you carry your questions like armor. Tell me, what do you hope to find?" The king, humbled by the sage's presence, knelt beside him. "I have asked what life means, what comes after death, and how one should live," he said. "I have heard many answers, yet none has stilled the restlessness in my heart. I seek understanding that is whole, not fragmented. I seek wisdom that is alive, not merely spoken." The sage nodded, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. Wisdom does not come from words alone, nor from books, nor from crowns. It comes from experiencing life with eyes wide open, with a heart unafraid to witness both beauty and suffering. "Tell me, your majesty, what have you seen in your journey?" The king recounted his steps, the festivals he had observed, the conversations he had overheard, the lessons whispered by the stars and the moon. He spoke of fleeting joy, the inevitability of death, the weight of responsibility, and the longing for a life lived rightly. The sage listened without interruption. Then slowly he began to speak. "You have sought truth externally, yet truth resides within. It is not something to be conquered, commanded, or collected. Truth is revealed in the clarity of attention, in the awareness of what is, and in the courage to face what cannot be changed. To know life, death, and the art of living, one must first look inward, unshielded by fear or pride." The king fell silent. The weight of the sage's words pressed gently upon him, like the first cool breeze after a long summer heat. For the first time, he realized that his restlessness had been fueled not by the complexity of life, but by his own attachment to certainty. He had sought to hold life in his hands, to grasp meaning, to contain truth. But wisdom, he now understood, could not be grasped. It had to be experienced. "Come," said the sage, rising and gesturing toward a small stream that cut through the forest floor. "Sit beside me and watch the water." The king obeyed. The river flowed silently, carrying leaves, petals, and sunlight along its path. He watched the currents, noticing how the water yielded to rocks, embraced the earth, and moved unceasingly forward. Slowly he began to see. Life itself was like this river. It could not be commanded, only followed with awareness. Every moment was precious because it passed, and in its passing it carried wisdom for those willing to see. The sage's voice broke the silence. "Do you see now? Life, death, and the manner of living are not separate mysteries. They are one river flowing through you, around you, and beyond you. The questions you carry are invitations to wakefulness. Each choice, each act, each breath is an opportunity to enter the flow, to touch the truth that is ever present." For hours, the king sat in silence, letting the rhythm of the river seep into his consciousness. He felt a shift within himself, subtle yet profound, a quiet acceptance that truth could not be rushed, that understanding comes through experience, not demand. As twilight fell, painting the forest in hues of amber and violet, the sage spoke again. "Walk among your people with this awareness. Carry these questions with humility and act with compassion. Observe, feel, and let life reveal its lessons. In time, the river will guide you, and the answers you seek will emerge, not as words but as living insight." The king rose, a sense of lightness in his heart that he had never known before. The path ahead was still uncertain, but he no longer feared its mysteries. He understood now that the journey itself was the teacher, and that every step, however small, was a step toward awakening. And so he returned to his kingdom, not as a ruler seeking control, but as a student of life, carrying with him the quiet power of the sage's wisdom, ready to meet the impermanence, transformation, and profound truths that awaited in the chapters still to unfold. The king returned to his palace with the sage's words echoing in his mind like a soft, persistent bell. Life, death, and the art of living, they were not separate mysteries but a single current flowing endlessly. Yet as he walked through the halls, gazing at his treasures, listening to the distant laughter of his people, a profound question arose again. How can one truly live wisely, knowing that all things will pass? He began to notice impermanence everywhere. The gold in his vaults glimmered brilliantly, yet even it could not resist the slow erosion of time. Palaces, built with stone and sweat, would one day crumble. Friends and allies who once stood steadfast could be lost to illness, war, or fate. Joy itself, the sweetest of human experiences, slipped through his fingers as easily as sand. One evening he wandered to the palace gardens, where cherry blossoms floated on the breeze, delicate and ephemeral. He watched a single petal detach, drifting lazily to the ground, and it struck him with startling clarity. Beauty, like life, is fleeting. To grasp too tightly is to invite suffering. To resist the flow is to deny reality. The king remembered the sage teaching beside the river, and he returned to the forest seeking deeper insight. The sage was waiting, as though time itself had paused for their reunion. Without speaking, the sage guided the king to a hillside overlooking a valley where the seasons revealed themselves in silent cycles. Trees shed their leaves, rivers swelled and receded, the wind carried seeds to new soil. The sage finally spoke. Impermanence is the truth of all things. Mountains erode, rivers change course, life rises and falls. To resist this is to suffer, to see it clearly is to awaken. The king's heart trembled. He realized that his previous restlessness had been born from a desire to fix life, to hold it still, to make the fleeting permanent. And yet, in surrendering to impermanence, he glimpsed a freedom he had never known. For if all things are transient, then attachment is optional, and compassion, clarity, and presence become possible. Does this mean nothing matters? He asked, the weight of the question pressing upon him. On the contrary, the sage replied, because all is fleeting, every moment matters more than you realize. The same petal that falls is the same petal that nourishes the earth. The same life that passes can sow seeds of kindness, wisdom, and love. Impermanence does not diminish the value of life. It intensifies it. To live fully, one must embrace the transient nature of all things. The king thought of the soldiers who fought bravely yet knew not if they would see the next sunrise, of the merchants whose fortunes rose and fell with the tides of the market, of the children who laughed without understanding the fragility of life. In their impermanence, he saw the raw beauty of existence, a beauty that demanded attention, reverence, and care. He returned to his kingdom transformed. He spoke with his subjects not as a distant ruler, but as one who had felt the fleeting nature of power, wealth, and life itself. He encouraged acts of kindness, not for reward or renown, but because they mattered in the moment they were given. He learned to act with clarity, to make decisions rooted in awareness rather than desire, to love without clinging. Through observing impermanence, the king understood a deeper truth. Life is a river and each moment is a current. To grasp it, to hold it, is to suffer. To flow with it, to recognize its impermanence, is to awaken. The path of wisdom was not in resisting change, but in moving gracefully with it, touching each moment fully before it passed. And so, the king's journey continued, not in search of static answers, but in embracing the ever-changing river of existence. He knew that impermanence would continue to challenge him, to teach him, and to guide him toward the final truths that lay at the heart of life itself. waiting patiently in the chapters yet to unfold. The king had come to see life as a river, its currents carrying joy and sorrow, beginnings and endings. He had embraced impermanence, learning to move with the flow rather than resist it. Yet the question of death lingered like a shadow stretching across the horizon. What happens when the river reaches its final bend? Determined to confront this mystery, the king returned once more to the sage in the quiet forest. They walked together along a winding path, the canopy above filtering sunlight into fractured patterns on the earth. The sage paused at a tranquil pool, its surface reflecting the sky in perfect stillness. "Observe this water," the sage said. "See how it is never truly still, yet always appears the same. Life is like this pool. It changes moment to moment, yet the essence continues. Death is not an ending, but a transformation, a passage from one form to another." The king listened, trying to grasp the depth of the words. "Are you saying that I, or any of us, will continue beyond the body?" he asked, a mixture of curiosity and fear in his voice. "Perhaps," replied the sage. "What continues is not the form you cling to, but the energy of your actions, the imprint of your intentions, the seeds you plant in the world. In Buddhist understanding, this is the law of karma and the cycle of rebirth. Each life is a ripple, affecting what comes next, shaping the conditions that follow. Death does not destroy, it transforms." The king closed his eyes, imagining his own life as a flame, its light passing from one candle to another, never truly extinguished but changing form. The realization both comforted and challenged him. If death was a transformation, then each act, each thought, each choice mattered beyond the narrow confines of his present existence. The weight of responsibility became palpable. The sage continued, "Most fear death because they cling to the self, to identity, to what they possess. But the self is like water in your pool, shifting, flowing, momentary. To fear death is to misunderstand it. Instead, see it as part of the vast cycle, part of the river of existence that carries all things. And in this understanding, live each moment with awareness, kindness, and purpose." The king thought of the lives he had witnessed, soldiers who had fallen in battle, mothers who had lost children, artisans whose creations faded with time. He began to see that the sorrow of death was inseparable from the beauty of life. Just as the river nourishes the earth even as it flows away, the energy of each being continues in forms unseen, shaping the world in ways both subtle and profound. Returning to his palace, the king carried a quiet sense of reverence. He treated life itself as sacred, knowing that the consequences of actions, however small, were never lost. Decisions were no longer merely political or practical. They were moral, spiritual, and eternal in their resonance. Every word spoken, every act of compassion, every choice made with clarity became a stone cast into the infinite river, creating ripples that would carry on beyond his lifetime. Yet, even with this understanding, the king recognized that knowledge alone was not enough. To live wisely, to act with virtue, and to face death without fear required continuous practice, reflection, and presence. He realized that the cycle of life and death was not a riddle to be solved, but a truth to be embodied. As night fell, he gazed at the stars, shimmering like sparks from the eternal river of existence. He felt a quiet assurance settle in his heart. Death was no longer a terror to flee, nor a mystery to endlessly debate. It was a companion, a teacher, a doorway into deeper understanding. And as the king lay down to rest, he sensed the next lesson awaiting him. The practical, living truth of wisdom in daily life, the art of walking consciously through each fleeting moment, and the ways in which understanding life, death, and impermanence could transform not only a kingdom, but the very essence of his being. The king now carried within him the lessons of meaning, the truth of death, and the reality of impermanence. Yet understanding alone was not enough. He faced the final living question: how should one walk through each day with wisdom, so that life is neither wasted nor fearful? He sought the guidance of the sage once more, journeying to the quiet forest where the air seemed thick with timelessness. The The sage greeted him without words, guiding the king along a narrow path lined with ancient trees whose roots intertwine like the hidden connections of life itself. "Your Majesty," the sage said, "you have glimpsed the truths of existence, but wisdom is not a treasure to hold, it is a path to walk. To live wisely is to translate understanding into action, thought into virtue, and knowledge into compassion." The king listened intently. He had ruled with power, sought answers in texts and debates, and witnessed the flow of life and death. Yet he realized that true wisdom required engagement with the world, not retreat from it. To live wisely, the sage continued, one must cultivate awareness, acting with intention rather than habit. Every word spoken, every decision made, every gesture carries weight. Observe the impact of your actions, choose them carefully, and do not cling to outcomes. Wisdom is not measured by the results, but by the consciousness with which you move through life. The king thought of the soldiers who followed orders without thought, the merchants chasing profit with blind ambition, the scholars lost in endless speculation. He understood now that their lives, though filled with activity, often lacked awareness, the very element that transforms action into wisdom. "Act with compassion," the sage said, "but do not bind yourself in attachment. Serve others but remain free within. Embrace the impermanence of all things, yet let your deeds sow seeds that endure beyond the fleeting moment. This is the path of wise living." The king reflected on the simplicity and depth of these instructions. He returned to his kingdom with a new perspective, walking among his people in humility and attention. He listened to their stories, shared in their struggles, and guided with understanding rather than decree. Decisions were made not only for political gain, but for the welfare of the entire community, recognizing the interconnectedness of all beings. In the palace, he encouraged the practice of mindfulness among his court. Meetings began with quiet reflection. Disputes were approached with fairness and patience. He fostered generosity, kindness, and ethical conduct, not as abstract ideals, but as living principles to guide daily life. Slowly, the culture of the kingdom began to shift, resonating with the clarity and compassion of a ruler who had truly understood the lessons of impermanence and death. The king also cultivated his own inner life. Meditation became a daily practice, not as ritual but as a means to observe his thoughts, recognize attachments, and act with clarity. He learned to face fear, anger, and desire without being controlled by them, seeing each emotion as a signal rather than a master. In the quiet moments, he would walk among the gardens, observing the delicate balance of life, the bee landing on a flower, the wind bending the branches, the subtle passage of sunlight across the petals. These small observations became teachers, revealing the intricate interconnection of all things. And yet, he knew that wisdom was not a destination but a journey. Each day offered new challenges, fresh opportunities to act with awareness, and new moments to cultivate compassion. The king had learned that living wisely required constant practice, humility, and the courage to confront life as it truly is, fleeting, fragile, and full of potential for awakening. Through his transformation, the kingdom itself began to reflect this path of wise living. Subjects found guidance not only in laws and decrees, but in the example set by a ruler who lived with mindfulness and virtue. And as the sun set over the palace, casting long shadows across the gardens, the king felt a deep serenity. He had discovered that the path of wise living was not in grand victories or eternal fame, but in the conscious, compassionate, and courageous way one engages with each precious moment. The lessons of life, death, impermanence, and wise living had begun to weave themselves into the very fabric of the king's being. No longer was he the restless ruler who sought answers in distant scholars or hidden texts. Now he had become a living embodiment of the truths he had pursued, a king transformed not merely in knowledge, but in heart, mind, and action. The people of his kingdom noticed the change. Where once he had ruled with authority alone, now he led with compassion and understanding. When disputes arose among his subjects, he listened first, sought context, and guided them toward fairness rather than issuing swift, unchecked decrees. Merchants, farmers, and soldiers alike found in him not only a ruler, but a teacher of the way to live with awareness and integrity. His actions reflected the wisdom he had cultivated. He invested in education so that knowledge would serve understanding, not arrogance. He supported the arts so that beauty and joy could flourish alongside duty and labor. He created spaces for reflection and meditation, inviting his people to witness the flow of life and the subtle lessons embedded in each moment. Yet the king's transformation was not limited to the governance of his kingdom. Within his own heart, he had let go of the grasping that had once defined him. He no longer clung to power, nor feared death, nor sought eternal glory. Instead, he moved through life with humility and presence, aware that every moment carried the potential for insight, compassion, and grace. The court, once a place of ceremony and rigid protocol, became a living laboratory of mindfulness. Courtiers observed the king's manner, his calm speech, his attentive listening, his patience in decision-making. They began to emulate his ways, recognizing that true authority did not arise from fear or dominance, but from clarity, wisdom, and ethical conduct. Traveling through the kingdom, the king saw the world as interconnected, each being a thread in the vast tapestry of existence. He visited villages, spoke with elders, and listened to children. He learned their struggles and joys, and in doing so, deepened his own understanding of life's impermanence and the delicate balance between action and acceptance. His inner transformation was mirrored in the kingdom's flourishing. Conflicts decreased, cooperation grew, and a sense of shared responsibility emerged among the people. The king realized that his own awakening had the power to ripple outward, transforming not just himself, but the world around him. At night, he would often return to the quiet gardens of the palace, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the questions that had once haunted him about the meaning of life, the nature of death, and the art of living, and he saw them now not as burdens, but as guides. Each question had been a gate, and passing through them had led him to a state of deep awareness and compassionate action. And yet, the king knew that transformation was not a single moment, nor a final state. It was a continuous practice, a commitment to live in alignment with the truths he had discovered. Every choice, every interaction, every breath remained an opportunity to cultivate wisdom and virtue. In the quiet of his chambers, he contemplated the vastness of existence, the cycles of birth and death, the impermanence of all things, and the profound interconnectedness of life. A profound serenity settled within him, a calm born not of certainty, but of acceptance, clarity, and purposeful engagement with the world. The king had become more than a ruler. He had become a living teacher, a beacon of mindful leadership and compassionate wisdom. His transformation illuminated a simple, enduring truth, that the deepest power lies not in dominion over others, but in mastery over oneself, that the highest glory is not in conquest, but in understanding, and that a life lived with awareness, compassion, and courage can ripple outward, touching countless lives in ways both visible and unseen. The kingdom thrived not because of wealth or armies, but because its king had walked the path of awakening, embodying the lessons of the river, the forest, and the sage's quiet guidance. And in this transformation, the eternal questions of life, once heavy burdens, had become living companions, guiding the king and his people toward a future rich with wisdom, compassion, and mindful presence. The king's journey, long and winding, had reached a moment of quiet reflection. The restless heart that once wandered through palaces, forests, and riverbanks in search of meaning had been transformed. He had faced the three questions that haunt every human life. What is the meaning of life? What happens after death? How should one live? And through this quest, he had glimpsed the eternal truths that connect all beings. Yet the story does not end with him alone. The three questions, like three stars in an endless night sky, continue to shine, inviting each of us to embark on our own journey. They are not solved with a single answer, nor contained in a sacred text. They live within every heart that dares to seek understanding, that dares to awaken. The meaning of life, once a riddle that seemed so distant, is revealed in the simple awareness of existence, in kindness offered without expectation, in compassion extended to all beings, in the courage to face joy and sorrow alike. It is not found in conquest or accumulation, but in the conscious unfolding of each moment. The mystery of death, once feared as a silent end, is understood as transformation. Life flows onward, beyond the confines of a single body, beyond the grasp of permanence. Each action, each thought, each ripple of intention continues to shape the world, reminding us that death is not a thief, but a guide, pointing toward the sacred impermanence of all things, and the art of living wisely. The third question remains the ultimate practice. To live with awareness, to act with virtue, to embrace impermanence, and to walk in harmony with the flow of existence is a path that requires constant attention. It is a path that asks us to engage fully with life, to cultivate understanding, and to embody the truths we have glimpsed. The king, now transformed, understood that these questions were never meant to be answered once and for all. They are living companions, present in every breath, in every encounter, in every choice. They call us to awaken, to move beyond fear and attachment, and to embrace the profound responsibility and joy of conscious existence. And so, the story of the king is not merely a tale of one man's journey. It is a mirror of our own inner quests. Each of us, in moments of reflection, in silence, in struggle, confronts these same questions. And like the king, we may find that the journey itself is the teacher, that wisdom is a living practice, and that the true answers arise not from certainty, but from presence, courage, and compassion. As the stars wheel silently above, the river flows endlessly onward, and the three great questions continue to live in the hearts of those willing to seek. They invite us to awaken, to act with love, and to walk through life with eyes open, hearts awake, and spirits attuned to the eternal rhythm of existence. The king's journey has ended, but the questions remain, alive, radiant, and eternal, waiting for each of us to take the first step toward our own awakening. If this journey into the three great questions of life resonated with you, take a moment to breathe and reflect on it. And if you feel drawn to explore more teachings, timeless wisdom, and mindful insights from Buddhism, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. By joining our community, you'll walk alongside us in discovering clarity, compassion, and the quiet power of presence. Hit the bell so you never miss a moment of reflection. And remember, each step you take with awareness is a step toward awakening.